inside my head. I try to turn it down, but I can't quite drown it out. I'm tortured.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. You're listening to Society Bites Radio, and I'm your host, Dr. Richard HIMMER.
And I'm CHERI, HIMMER, and this is Authentically You, Social Interaction for the Mind and Soul.
So for the next 25 minutes, we talk about healing from the inside out. Remember, you are 100% responsible for your happiness, joy, and well-being.
So right now we're all in this situation. We're in stay-at-home quarantines, and it's been really interesting to track what's happening in various households. Richard is wearing his I've survived the 2020 corona outbreak, or at least so far he's survived.
With a roll of toilet paper.
With a giant roll of toilet paper. Maybe we should offer these on our website.
I'll take a picture of it.
Our son designed some family T-shirts, and our daughter-in-law printed them up. And so we are working hard at surviving, as all of you are at this time. That's pretty critical for our nation and our country and our world. And anyways, praying that all of you are well. But it's been interesting to note how different households are coping. And so I'm dealing with a lot of Zoom meetings and
so perspective-wise, Sherry's a school teacher,
so
and they shut down schools. Is it 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago. We've been teaching from home, and so teaching by Zoom, and a lot of colleague meetings and staff meetings, and so you get a little glimpse into people's households and such, and then hearing the chat about how it's going and the new kinds of pressures we're dealing with, like all the uncertainty, the change, the learning curve. It's a pretty steep learning curve for a lot of technical tools that we are now adding to for teachers, our arsenal. But I think the whole world is having to figure out, okay, now I have to connect through the internet, but then you still you're now with your family while you're working.
So you have the new stress and anxiety, but what I'm seeing is about every day, maybe 2 a day, I'm getting emergency requests to talk. Either existing clients or friends or new potential prospects who are just having a tremendously difficult time.
So we've noted from the households that we're connected with, there's kind of two poles of how these whole households are coping. There's the ones that were fearful of what this was going to be like, and now they're finding bonding amongst their children that wasn't happening before. Things are warm and fuzzy for right now. Blessings and positives that they see.
Right.
And then on the other side, you've got these tinder boxes of people getting triggered and sometimes flooded. And your phone's been ringing with a lot of those situations.
Right. And the difference between trigger and flood, I think, it's worthy of explaining that again. So we often use the word I'm triggered. What they're really saying is I'm flooded. So trigger means there's something on the radar screen going on, that your awareness is heightened. It's either a positive or a negative. In context in which we're speaking, it's a negative. So that means something has been made aware to you at the body-brain level, the subconscious level, and you feel it. So it's an awareness.
Yeah.
Flooded is fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Triggered is neutral. It's not good. It's not bad. It's an awareness. What you do with the trigger is what's critical. And today's segment is going to be on scenarios where people went from trigger to flood. And how do you arrest that? How do you stop this from going from being triggered to being flooded? That's kind of the storyline.
Right. And so, we all have our points that we get triggered and sometimes go to flood. And now it's a whole new dynamic because you're stuck in the house and you're stuck with maybe those trigger points that are your family members and those conversations that are happening and those words that fly around that are triggers for you. All of those things are capsulized into the contents of your household and within the walls of your home, and it could feel like a tinderbox for you. So we're going to try to work your way out of that. We're trying to give you some solutions for how to get through this corona tinderbox that we're experiencing.
So one of the first ones that happened earlier in the week came from a Midwest city where I got an emergency text message. Can you please call my husband? He's having a really rough time. And so I quickly asked what's going on. And then the husband reached out and contacted me and says, now's not a good time, but I'll get back to you. In the meantime, she had driven from her city to another city to help out. And it's like an hour or two drive to help out a family, where he had to go to a different city and help work. He became the focal point in his Midwestern city for the coronavirus outbreak. He was the what's it called?
You call him the biotech? Or?
No, the SME, subject matter expert. I couldn't find the word. It's called the SME.
I didn't know that.
So he was the subject matter expert for the city on the outbreak, right? So he was the communication liaison for all the doctors and city officials. Right now, let's put this in perspective. I've got a husband who's incredibly intelligent, PhD intelligent. The wife, who also is very educated, very intelligent, but is much more in tune with what's going on with emotional intelligence, whereas the husband is not. He sees a task to be done and he does the task. And in so doing, when other people weren't understanding and he wasn't able to communicate it the way they wanted it done, tensions started to increase. 2.5 days of no sleep and no food, with him trying to communicate what's going on to public officials and doctors, finally hit him. As he exited the shower, I don't remember which morning this was. This week has been a blur to me. He literally crumpled and fell to the ground crying. He didn't have anything left in the tank to give. He'd given it all and was overly flooded. The wife is watching this going on and had been building up. So the two are trying to communicate. And the initial phone call from her was, help my husband get through this. But what it ended up being is, how do I communicate with my husband when he's melting down?
Yeah, so that's interesting because of the different stressors that we're experiencing, new stressors for many of us.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there isn't a person on the planet that isn't watching what's going on and feeling like a huge amount of uncertainty. How do we get through handle ourselves, but how do we handle others who are crumbling around us?
Okay, so what we've started with, first of all, was, we'll call them Ralph and Gertie.
Yeah.
So Gertie was going out of town. She had to go out of town. And so I had to call her on the phone. She was actually going into some sort of a meeting. She said, what do I do? When Ralph is melting down, how do I handle it? And then she told me what she did. And so she pushed him and pushed him and pushed him to try to get an answer from him. And then she tried to get him to agree that her way of looking at this was correct. Now let's stop for a second. In effective communication, when the stakes are not high, if you try to seek agreement, you're automatically going to put the other person on the defensive, right? So what we talked about was, where you want to start is to connect and to redirect. Now, we've had a segment on this on parenting, connect, redirect, leadership, connect and redirect. Now we're talking about in intense situations.
And spouse relationships, which are the most intense relationship, really.
So a connect and redirect simply means it's very important that the other person knows what you're going through. Now, what's really important here also is you don't have to agree with them, but that you know what they're going through is all they care about.
Seek the understanding of what they're going through.
So what we talked about was, how do you then reach out to the husband who's going through a really difficult time and just connect with them? So we role played a few things. So, honey, it sounds like the doctor over here wasn't understanding what you were saying. What happened? What was that like for you? Or what was it like for him? What was he saying? What were you saying? All you're trying to do is to get them to understand that you care about what they're going through without biasing the space.
So it's so good and well to know this, and that we've talked about this before, but it is really, really hard, especially when you are halfway triggered about what's going on in the news. When your anxiety level's already kind of brewing because you're worried and you're hearing about what feels like doomsday material constantly on the news, it's really hard to settle yourself to the point that you can be mindful enough to say, okay, I'm going to focus on this person and understand what they're going through as a way to connect.
So you segued in the two segments from here, if our plans go according to the way we drew them up. How do you do mindfulness? How do you
So I guess what
balance?
I'm trying to insert right now is that there's a point of to calm your household and be a conduit of calmness for someone else. You're going to have to be calm yourself.
Yeah, and we will be addressing that in an upcoming segment. How do you create that balance within your space, within your body and your mind?
Okay, so given that we can calm our own anxieties.
So we'll cover that, but in this particular case, what we talked about is first the connect and redirect, making sure that Ralph knew Gertie understood his position from his point of view, not Gertie's bias of how it should be. Which reminds me, I need to make a note of another one about another story we can talk about. So what happened here was we role played how she could then get Ralph to feel that he's understood. And I'm going to say it for the third time. When you connect with someone else, it's not about you. It's not about your perception, your bias, or your opinion. The reality is that person, the last thing they want to hear is your point of view. What they're dealing with is a crisis. It's huge to them. If you want to be a help, don't insert yourself as a know-it-all or someone who thinks they can solve the problem. That's going to escalate the scenario. Step 2. So once she connects, what's going on here? So what you're saying is that they're not understanding it, or you can't communicate this over here, etc. So she knows where Ralph is. Then you do what's called a conversation inventory. So what I taught her at this particular juncture was to simply ask the question, what are you trying to get done? How is that working? What's worked? What isn't working?
What is she trying to get done in the conversation?
Talking
itself?
to Ralph.
Oh,
Ralph. What's your goal?
Right. Okay.
What do you? So you're trying to explain this to the doctors,
and
right?
This is where the redirection comes, right?
Correct. You're redirecting it, but you use a conversation inventory. So when you say to Ralph, or when she said to Ralph, what is it that you're trying to accomplish with the doctors? What's the main message? He's already told his story. He feels that the wife is listening. Now he's going to articulate what his message is. Now, if his message is very confusing to the wife, she can say, that's hard for me to understand. It seems that right now the intensity is pretty high. I wonder if there's a way we could reword that. What do you think? Notice how the redirect came into an inventory of, boy, it seems that. There's no judgment in it seems that. And then offered, what do you think of doing this? Is a question to him without her biasing the story. So it seems that, what do you think, is a non-judgmental position to be in if done neutrally. Now, I've done this long enough to know there are many people who will take the information I just shared and use it manipulatively.
Yeah. There is a danger with that.
There's a danger.
And there's a tone, and it smells very strongly to the other person that they're being manipulated, even though the words are formed the same way.
Hence, I'm emphasizing the ability to learn to be neutral, the ability to learn to keep your bloody bias out of the story. And I say it that way because right now, every emergency I've got is biased driven. Someone has to be right. And that person who has to be right is flooded. That means they're in fight, flight, freeze, or faint, and it's an addictive behavior to always have to be right. Now, he's a SME. He's the subject matter expert.
So he's supposed to be right in his job.
He's supposed to be right, right.
Well,
But everybody is high anxiety in that moment, right? So he reached out and he says, I can talk right now. I have a break. Can we please talk? So I reached out to him, and this is what happened. He told me his story, and I did my best to connect. Then he said, what do I do, Dr. Himmer? So he's asking me for a solution. I am now empowered to opine.
Well, so it's so interesting that just as human beings, that when we get our major concern off our chest to another human being, then we can open up to possibilities.
But if we can't, if we haven't been able to open that up, then they're giving us the solution. You exacerbate the scenario. It makes it worse.
Yeah.
Okay, so I taught him in the moment trigger busters. I've taught trigger busters to thousands of people. But in all my life, I have never felt so rewarded, so satiated when I taught this gentleman trigger busters. Now, let me put it in perspective. Remember, this is a much more intelligent man than I am. PhD.